Welcome everybody to another edition of Coffee and Open Source. To meet some friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you yourself or you know anybody who would be interested in coming on chatting, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is IsaacR11, or you can reach out to me on Mastodon. My handle there is IsaacR11 at fossadon.org. All right, so with that out of the way, coffee is half full, but I don't think I'm going to need it. This conversation is going to be really good. I'm really looking forward to it. We're having some great conversation before, and let's just get right into it. My guest today is Rob Conery. Rob,
hello.
Do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself.
Hello, but first, before we get there, show me that coffee container mug thing you got. What is this?
It's like you can just buy them at Starbucks.
No, wait, for coffee and open source, we have to talk about, if you're going to do coffee.
I used to do this. I used to talk about coffee, and then I realized my coffee knowledge isn't very good. Honestly, I just like the way that. Okay, this is inside baseball. We can talk about this too. So for whatever reason, I really like the name Coffee and Open Source. I think it rings pretty good. There's some other shows, podcasts, entities that are similar that have similar names or whatever, and I tried to get like a Microsoft podcast sponsored thing called Coffee and Open Source, and it didn't work out. And I was like, I'm just gonna do it myself. Nobody I own this is my thing, so I started doing it. And I actually the first couple of episodes we would spend a few minutes talking about coffee, and I realized really quickly that I don't like coffee as much as everybody else does. I think.
Oh, well, that's because you're not making it right.
Well, no, that's a whole yeah. So I mean.
Anyway, yeah, I sabotaged you here.
No. This is great. No, I mean, so typically my go-to coffee, honestly, and this is the most lame thing ever, is just a nice medium roast iced coffee. That's my thing. And if I'm fancy, I'll do a latte or an Americano. That's kind of my fancy. I don't have the $3,000 espresso machine with all the things. I don't do that. But I appreciate people that really care about it. I've had very expensive coffee in nice places in the world, and I'm like, this coffee doesn't taste much different than Starbucks to me. Yeah. And people literally lose their mind when I say things like that.
You know, I spent $50 on a thing called a Hario V60, which is it's like a pour over, but it's this really nice glass thing, but it's got a little switch at the bottom, so you can do immersion stuff. So you can buy good beans, do immersion, and then for you, if you put that over ice for iced coffee, that's the Japanese iced coffee style. So good. Anyway, there's that.
Yeah. I went to a place in Manhattan one. This is also a thing. I was working with a guy, and he's like, we have to go. This is one of the best coffee places in Manhattan. Blah blah blah. So we went, and got the guy who was working there, had a handlebar mustache, the whole thing. And they were doing the pour over, the very sophisticated pour over where it's pour over, pause, pour over, whatever, right? And and he's like, you have to try it. I had some. I'm like, okay, it's good. And he was expecting me to have some euphoric moment, and I just didn't. And I think he realized what a waste of $16 or whatever the coffee was, right? Because he bought me a $16 coffee, and I'm all right, man. Again, I this is an Isaac rant. There are not a lot of things that Isaac is oh my gosh, this is the best thing ever. I like food, but I haven't had a meal in a long time that was oh my gosh, this is the best thing I've ever eaten. Yeah. I was in Las Vegas a week and a half ago, and there's this guy named Keith Lee on TikTok who does food reviews, and he's pretty well known, whatever, right? And I went to one of his places that he recommended, and the food was very, very good. But it didn't knock me down this is the best thing I've ever eaten, because I haven't had that experience in a long time. Maybe it's because I don't swing this is the best thing, this is the worst thing. I'm pretty in the middle a lot. But yeah, the coffee thing, I also people that drink, I don't really understand the people who collect really expensive whiskeys and all that. I don't understand that. Not to knock it if that's your hobby, to collect whiskeys and whatever, for instance, Richard Campbell. Richard Campbell's been on this show before. He knows his stuff, and he has good taste and Like I've just always been very enamored with people that take the time to like really appreciate things like that because it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I just haven't had a lot of, I guess, practice and stuff
You're
like
hard to
that.
please, is what you're saying. Hard to
No, no,
please.
no, no. I mean, it's not. Well, I'm also hard to disappoint too.
Oh, that's
So
good.
like,
No, you're
so I
right in the
mean,
middle there. I like it.
yeah. I mean, that's a good. That's it's yeah. Maybe I am hard. Maybe I am easy to disappoint too. I don't know. Maybe I'm
Yeah.
just. Maybe I just don't.
Well,
I just don't have the big swings. I think is what it is.
I tell you what, if you ever come to Santa Barbara, the funny thing is talking about all this, and I know we're way off topic, but whatever.
No, 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 no. It's a
Okay.
conversation.
The funny thing is I'm actually a little bit the opposite. Like I'll go out and have like sushi's a thing I love, or
Yeah.
I'll I like to watch YouTube and food channel stuff,
Hmm.
not the food channel, but food stuff on YouTube. And these guys and these people make these things that look amazing.
Yeah.
So I'll make
Yeah.
them. But anyway, the other night I went out to sushi here where I live and blew my mind. And like
Hmm.
once again, which I say this all the time, this is the best food I've ever had, which is so funny
Yeah. Yeah.
because like, what did I have? I had uni, which is a sea urchin, but they
Yep.
get it right out here where I live. They get it from the water right here, and same with you.
Sure.
They get it right there in the sound.
Hmm.
Um, you have fresh uni, man. See now, I know if you were sitting next to me, you'd be like, maybe not
So,
though.
well, this is
Maybe
my
not.
thing with, and I have a thing with sushi too. Like, so I
Okay.
grew up in a very small town, like a fishing town. My younger brother used to work on charter boats when he
Ooh.
was like 13 years old. He would come home with literal bags of halibut, bags of tuna,
God.
bags like, and we would, and now that's what I ate growing up. So like,
Ah,
you go to like any of these places, and I'm like, all right. That's why like if you're ever out with me at dinner, I will never order seafood because the seafood will never impress me. I'd rather like,
fair.
and my wife makes fun of me because she's like, you don't order seafood and you don't order steaks because I don't understand steaks either. Like, okay, like you're gonna tell me that this steak for $80 is better than the steak that I can make at my house? No,
Hmm.
problem. It might be, but I don't. I'm not
Hmm.
gonna take that risk.
Depends how it's made, but
And
yeah,
I,
yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
I've been to like I've been to Peter Luger's, I've been to Keen's, like I've been to like the good
Hmm.
steakhouses, and I'm like,
Jeez.
okay, I'm like, it's okay. Like, it's so
Yeah.
again, like I don't get super like I don't know, I don't
Hmm.
get pumped up. But yeah, like the seafood thing is funny too. So like literally, like I just order chicken like whenever we go out to dinner, which is so lame. Like it's
It's a
so
great
lame.
chicken.
This chicken is so. Also, I think because like you can't really mess up chicken. I think too. Like you can
Yeah,
overcook it so it's really dry, but like I mean, chicken is a
yeah.
pretty I guess bland tasting food. Like it's whatever
Can
you
be.
put to it, whatever you give to chicken, it will kind of mirror
Yeah.
back.
Hmm.
Um. Anyway,
Yes.
not enough about Isaac's really disappointing like thoughts on food and coffee and I want to learn some more about Rob. So let's do
Okay.
this. So I like to start conversations off with like origin stories, like when
Mhm.
people realized that technology was like their thing. Like, do you remember like a particular point in time? Like, you know, we've had people that are like, oh, I got, you know, CDs in the mail, or oh, I was on AOL or
Mhm.
MySpace or whatever, right? Like, do you remember when technology was like, yeah, well, I mean,
Yeah.
like that was my thing. Like,
Sure.
you know,
Yeah.
creating really horrible MySpace profiles is like my
Yeah.
intro into
Same.
like technology. Like,
Same deal.
when did tech like really introduce itself to you?
Let's see. That's an interesting question. When I was a kid, when I was younger, I was always the one. I literally would take apart the stereo.
Yeah,
I tried to connect it to the TV once, and this is back in the 70s and 80s. I guess more the 80s, but I wanted stereo sound, man. I figured
sure.
why can't I listen to the TV through the stereo? This is before people did that,
Yeah, yeah,
and so I did. I connected the stereo to the TV, and I managed to do it. And of course, my parents are out of their minds, like, "What are you doing?" But anyway, I was always that kid taking stuff apart.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
My brother came home, and this is really funny. My brother is a computer science, or was a computer science professor up at University of Oregon. He's now retired, but he brought over a computer, and I'm trying to remember. It was like a Radio Shack, one of the old ones, like one of the very first one. Anyway, it had
Yeah.
BASIC on it, and he was trying to show me BASIC, and I said, "Get this thing away from me! I hate it." Like I couldn't stand it. Like who would ever want to sit there and stare at a freaking computer all day?
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up going in high school. I took a BASIC class, and I had fun doing it. I
Yeah.
would lock into this thing, but I remember walking out of the classroom just feeling spacey. because I
Sure.
would just lose myself. And
Yeah.
I was like, I'm never going to do this. I'm never going to work on a computer ever. And so I still kept taking computer classes though. I took
Hmm.
Pascal in college. In fact, I minored in computer science just because I figured, well, maybe, maybe someday I'll use this. But I remember thinking I will never sit behind a computer all day. So my degree
Mm.
was actually in geology. And so I would spend most of my time in that class. We would spend, I would say, 2 hours for every hour, or 3 hours for every hour we were in the classroom. We'd spend three outside, which for
Hmm.
me I loved because I went to school at UCSB or Santa Barbara, and so we'd be all over the hillsides and the ocean and whatnot. It was great. So yeah, all through then, I was like, I am so glad I'm not staring at a computer screen. Even my
Yeah.
friends that were like accountants doing spreadsheets and making money, it's like you do you. I'm outside,
Yeah.
and so I went I got a job in the environmental industry, and I remember sitting there one day just looking at this person slogging through all of these Excel spreadsheets. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And they're like, we're trying to come up with sums for these monitoring well, like chemistry
Yeah.
results. We're trying to sum this stuff up and make sure it corresponds across the sheets. So we're doing this and that in a virtual thing. And I'm like, just use Access, the Microsoft Access. It comes with Windows 95. Just
Yeah.
anyway. So they're like, well, if you know how to do it, just do it. I'm like, oh God. So I kicked up a
There we go.
database, and I pulled it all in, and I ran a query, and I said, here's your result. And they go, how do you know it's right? I'm like, well, it's a database, man. Like
Yeah.
I don't know. You just hit the sum button right there. And so it was really funny. So that I enjoyed because it blew everybody away in the office. They couldn't believe it. I
Yeah.
saved them literally days and days and days and days of work. So I went home that night. I told my buddy, a good friend of mine from high school, who's still a good friend, Dave Nielsen. I told him about it. He's like, well, you got to learn relational theory if you're going to be doing databases. I'm like, what's that? And so he literally had a book on his shelf and he handed it to me and he said, you need to read about normalization. And it took me a good week or so to
Yeah.
understand what the heck, because I kept asking him like, why do I want to make it? Doesn't it seems like, oh, I get it. So anyway, I
Hmm.
normalized the entire database. I came up with this entire analytical system for this Superfund, which is a big cleanup site. And next thing I know, they're like, you are now the database person. And it was interesting how many people would come in my door every day. And then
Hmm.
how, like, I had generate reports. And I remember the boss of the office, the big boss, standing in front of me saying, if you ever screw up one of these reports, it's going to cost us millions of dollars. I hope you know that.
Mm.
And I'm like, what?
Why?
What do you mean? He goes, we're sending these reports to the government. And I'm
Oh.
like, oh. And he goes, and if you're wrong, not only are we going to get sued, but you're going to get fired, and on and on and on. Like, and then that's when I understood the power of not
Sure.
just coding, but databases in general. And I was hooked, not just because of the power, just because of the relevance, I suppose, because I felt like a lot of the things we were doing were not really relevant.
Yeah.
And there's a long other story about the environmental industry. But being able to work in this database and become an important member of the team, I was like, dang, I like
Yeah.
this. And then my buddy Dave called me a year later. This is in 1996. No, it's 1997. And he said, did you know that you can hook a database up to a web page? And I was like, why would you ever do that?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he showed me. And this is funny. I think he was in the first class of trainers that got certified to train people in ASP Classic. And so
Mm.
he taught me, he brought me to some of his classes and taught me how to do it. And then he's like, we could make some money doing this. I'm like, how? Who's going to pay for this? And he had
Everybody.
some,
The answer is
everybody.
everybody.
Next thing I know, we were off and running. I quit my
Yeah.
job as a geologist. We founded a company. We were located at 3rd Street in Brandon in San Francisco, had the whole 3rd floor, and just living the dot-com boom dream. It was so much
Yeah.
fun. So there's my origin story.
That's man, that is there's a lot to unpack there. I think the first
Yeah.
thing that I'd like to say is that you also learned a valuable lesson is like what is the worst way to instill like trust in an individual to say if you mess this up you're fired and we're going to lose a lot
Oh
of
yeah.
money.
Well,
Like
that's the life
that's
of it. That's the life of a
yeah.
DBA. That's why DBAs are
Yeah.
such jerks, because that's it. That's it right there.
Yeah.
They know if they
Yeah.
screw up,
Yeah.
not only are they going to get fired, but the entire company can go under. It's
Sure.
true.
Yeah, yeah. Coming to think of it, like every DBA I've ever ran across is kind of crusty, which
Oh yes.
that's a bummer. Anyway,
Yeah.
so you
Yeah.
mentioned something too that like immediately was like, oh, Isaac has that too, like the tinkering thing, right?
Yeah.
Like taking
Mhm.
apart VCRs or taking apart stereos, right? Was it because you were like curious about how things worked, or
Yeah.
was it because you just liked the idea, like the thrill of like, oh, like I have if I take it apart, I have to put it back together.
I think it was I wanted to understand it. Like
Yeah.
I think I was asking my oldest brother, John, the professor guy, how does a speaker make noise? And
Hmm.
he took the cover off of the speaker. And I remember thinking, what are you doing? And he's like, well, if you want to find out, we got to look.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then he tapped it with his finger and he says, this thing vibrates. And I said, how does it vibrate? He turned it because this is like one of those floor speakers,
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
the gold fabric on the front of it, the old
Hmm.
70s thing, wood cabinet. Anyway, he turned it around and he got a screwdriver out, took the screws off the back, and he showed me these wires. And he said, these wires fire that magnet, and that magnet pulses back and forth. I'm
Yep.
like, what? And he goes, a magnet. And he got a paper clip and he tossed it on the back of the speaker and it stuck to it. It's like,
Yeah.
you can turn that on and off with electricity, or not on and off, but you can reverse it.
Yep.
And I'm like, whoa, that's a trip. Wait, how do those, and then we started talking about
Yeah. You
electronics and
started going down
wires.
the rabbit hole. Yeah.
But the key being is he he loved to engage my curiosity, which is cool.
Hmm.
And I think that sometimes that's all it takes. Once you start getting curious and you get your first answer, it's like, if you read Atomic Habits and James Clear, he always talks about the first step. The first step will always, almost always lead to the second. The trick is to get yourself to the first step.
Yep.
And his
Yep.
canonical example, of course, is putting your running shoes by the door.
Yep.
And the goal being you want to become a runner. Well, get your shoes by the door. And then
Yep.
just doing that, you see your shoes, and then that's going to start this and that, and this and that. It's pretty amazing how engaging your curiosity as a kid, like for me, understanding, oh, there's a ground wire and a positive wire, and that makes speakers work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And from then, it's funny, when I turned 16, one of the first things I did is I went down to, I forgot what store it was. No, I went to swap meet. This is in Los Angeles. I went to the swap meet in Van Nuys and I bought myself, I think for $20, a little stereo that I'm sure wasn't stolen, little stereo unit that goes into a car. And I remember going to my brother's house, my other brother, who's a construction builder, and I said, will you help me put this in? He goes, you don't need my help. He's kind of brash. You don't need my help. You could figure it out. It's just the wires. You match the colors to the colors. And so I did. And I put in my car stereo. And I remember turning it on for the first time and just thinking, whoa. And it's like that sense of victory, right? Of I didn't know anything about how this worked until 10 minutes ago. And now I can do it. Now I can do it. This is really neat.
That's yeah. So the curiosity thing, I've had this
Yeah.
conversation a few times. Like, is curiosity something you just have, or can you gain a curiosity over time? Like, and the reason why I ask is because I feel like there are people that are always looking to learn about things and always looking to kind of extend their knowledge. And then there's
Mm.
some people that are just totally fine with the knowledge they currently possess.
That's a deep question. I've thought a lot about
Sure,
this.
sure, sure.
I don't think curiosity is itself a thing. I think it is a collection of things. Um, I think number one, you have to have uh, what's the word? For some reason, the word privilege is popping in my head, but I don't think that's correct. It's a sense of I I can allow myself to engage, or I won't get in trouble, or what, something like that. Like I deserve to know. That's it. I deserve to know.
Hmm.
And so that kind of goes along with courage, which is I I'm going to know. I deserve to know. I'm going to know. So there's a little self-worth in there, and there's also um, a lack of fear. I don't call it
Hmm.
courage. It's a lack of fear, and then you do it, and
Yeah.
and it's what actually goes into that activation energy is, to me, uh, a trick of the universe. I don't know. Like, you someday will get up, and for me, like, I don't have full ADD. I've taken tests before, whatever, but I know I
Yeah.
have a lot of it.
Yeah.
And sometimes just starting something, it's like, I don't feel like it. Like, yeah, just do it.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
hard to overcome, you know?
Well, there's the whole 28 days thing, right? Where like it's scientifically proven that the human brain needs you to do something 28 times to be able to
Yeah,
build a habit, right?
right.
And like, they say like, "Oh, if you can start a diet or if you can start exercising, if you can do it for the first month consistently, it's
Yeah,
something that you can typically stick with," right?
yeah,
Obviously, life gets in the way or whatever eventually, but for your brain to kind of crave that, what is it, whatever it's adrenaline, whether it's dopamine, whether it's endorphins, like it starts to
yep,
crave that after about 28 cycles,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
um there's something too that's kind of fascinating about what you were saying, and and maybe drilling into this a bit. So you have an older sibling who is, I guess you could say, like, computer scientists to me are very theoretical. They care
Mm-hmm,
about like big picture, that sort of
mm-hmm.
thing, right? And then you
Yep,
have another sibling who is very hands-on construction,
yep,
right?
right.
Cares very much about the tactileness, the like
Yep,
expect like, and you're, I mean, don't get me wrong, or you kind of fall a little bit in the middle, right? Like,
I
is
do.
that something? Do you think it's because you had those two individuals that were kind of feeding into your psyche, or was it like, do your parents have similar makeups? Like, we don't need to
You're
get
like,
into the
yeah,
whole like
it's
unwrapping
a
of
good, no,
Rob's
it's a good
family,
therapy
but
session. This is a
yeah,
great
yeah,
therapy session. Now, tell me about
yeah.
your
I got a
childhood.
couch. I got a couch. Yeah.
Now, it's interesting. I do think about this a lot because my older brother has so much patience and resolve and discipline. It's ridiculous.
Hmm.
Like, I remember him, it was just recently, he was on the Tesla website because he likes Teslas. And he was on a Tesla website. And I said, "Didn't you just buy one?" And he goes, "Well, I'm reserving my next one,
Hmm.
when the lease is up on the first one." I'm like, "That's like 2.5 years away, man."
Yeah.
And he goes, "Well, I mean, I want what I want."
Yeah.
Whoa. I wouldn't even think about it until like a month before the lease is up.
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So my other brother's funny. So my oldest brother, he's tall. He's a big barrel chested guy. And then my younger brother, or not my younger brother, I'm the youngest of all of them. The next brother, Larry, is he's pretty skinny. Like, he's kind of
Sure.
wiry, for the lack of
Yeah.
better words. So he drives dump trucks, um, and and has the most energy of anybody I've ever known. He just turned 70. He's still out in the water surfing every day. And we're at my mom's just recently, and he went in the garage and cleaned the damn garage just because he was bored. And I'm like,
Mm.
how do you have all this
Yeah.
energy? Anyway,
Yeah.
I sit somewhere in between them. I I don't know. I don't know how they do the things they do. And I wish I had Larry's energy. I wish I had my brother John's resolve. I don't. I'm just
But you
me.
got a little bit of both, right? That's
I got a
like
little bit
that.
of
Yeah.
both.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, I think that's what's very interesting too. Is like we're constantly, as we're young, we're responding to all this different stimuli, right? And some stick, some doesn't, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's fascinating, like the idea of like how people shape, and like something as simple as like, I didn't want to be in front of a computer, like that thought
Yeah.
that's it, and then even though you didn't want to, you
Yeah.
still continually gravitate toward it because you were interested in it, because it
Hmm.
lit something up in your brain that your brain was looking for at a particular time, which I think is absolutely fascinating. Like, you see
Yep.
this a lot where people are like, I didn't want to do this, but I keep falling into it. And it's usually
Yep.
negative, right?
Yep.
Like,
Yep.
but for you, like, this is very much a positive experience. Because I mean, I don't know if you would say this, but I would say this as an outside observer, like, you sticking with computers was probably a good thing,
Yeah.
right?
It was a
Um,
good thing. I
yeah.
think.
So,
I think. Yeah.
well, I mean, I don't know. I'm a fan anyway. Um,
Thanks.
so so we kind of down this path of, if you you have this geology degree,
Hmm.
and I've been very open in saying, like, one of my favorite courses I ever took in college was Geology 101,
Hmm.
because I had a teacher who was from Hawaii.
Hmm.
He loved, like, the whatever he did, how, like, it just got to me directly, like the idea of, just how the earth is made up and all this. But one thing I realized going through that course is like, so much tech in geology and environmental studies and environmental
Oh
sciences,
yeah.
right? Like, GIS systems are a thing.
Oh
Like,
yes.
and so here's a question for you. Like,
Sure.
with your geology background, and you kind of fell into this sort of computing thing. Looking back on it now, because now when you like if you're in geology, like you kind of have to know all the tech tools, right?
Mhm.
Do you think that this was like kind of at the beginning of that, I guess, progression in that industry, where if I'm going to be in geology, like I need to know a good amount about the tech, and I need to know
Mhm.
like how these systems work? Is that kind of, was that at the beginning of that?
Yeah. When I was at the environmental company, the GIS system, I'm struggling to come up with a name. If you, it's still one of the most popular ones, but I had to
Yeah.
learn it. And of course, they came to me. It's hysterical. They came to me and they're like, "We need to plot out where the wells and the boring holes are. So you need to go plot these in 3 dimensions, so we know how deep and whatever."
Yep.
Okay, and it was easy to learn because you can import a spreadsheet, and I knew spreadsheets. And it's funny because I called my buddy who's an accountant, and I'm like, "What's that formula again for the thing that does the thing?" And he's like, "Oh, it's this." And so here I'm writing
Yep.
VBA, and and then he showed me how to get in and write the VBA. I'm like, "Oh, I got this now." And so
Yep.
I'm actually started to make these VBA forms and Access as well. And that's when I learned how to make Access applications. But yeah, you needed to know that you still do. Although I think a hardcore geologist would argue about this, um, because it's not about the tools.
Hmm.
And this is an interesting thing. I was trying to a little. I don't know if this will help illustrate what I mean. My buddy Matt, when I lived in Hawaii, we were at the beach one day, Kalihiwai, which is one of my favorites. Anyway, it's just like a beach in a canyon, beautiful white sand, and these hills that go up about 800 feet or so, all around you, lush green. Anyway, we're looking at everything. He goes, "You want to give me a geology lesson?" And I was like, "Sure." And I mean, what do you want to know? It's all volcanic. That's kind of what I
Yeah.
said. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
kind of funny. He goes, "Well, I mean, that's basalt, right?" I'm like, "Yeah, but I mean, there's way more here than just rocks." And he goes, "What do
Hmm.
you mean?" And that right there to me was always the joy of doing geology, because you look up and you see a mountain, right? Or maybe like for you, where you are, yeah, you see the peninsula, you see the sound, and then you see the Cascade Range behind. You know a little bit about it, but when you're doing geology, it is a fat mystery, man. I mean,
Sure.
and the best part is the clues are right there. And so when we're talking about all this, my buddy Matt and I was like, "Well, look at where you're sitting right now. Where are you sitting?" He goes, "What do you mean? I'm sitting in the sand." "Well, how'd the sand get here?" And
Yeah.
he kind of looks at me and he goes, "From the ocean?" I'm like, "Well, sort of, And then we got
Yeah.
into this whole process of making sand, river flow, the fact that we're sitting in a canyon that was carved out by a river. Where's the river? The river's right behind us. And so where'd the river come from? And then we kind of just we ask these questions. And I think that was always the thing that fascinated me about geology is you have to know, you never take anything for granted, ever, ever, ever. You write everything down, and then it turns into a detective mystery. And then
Yeah.
you start slowly going in. And tying this into your question, yeah, you need to have the tools, because sometimes the tools can uncover relationships you don't know about.
Hmm.
For instance, the GIS thing I was telling you about, one of the things that we used to do, um, we used to go out and we'd measure groundwater levels in these monitoring wells. And so Chrissy Field was one in San Francisco. I always remember doing, because I'd go out there. I've had a couple gauges in a couple of the wells that would measure water movement over time, and it was so fascinating. I didn't know what to expect, right? How is the water move? Because water comes from uphill, downhill
Yep.
by gravity flow, and it's really fascinating because it was moving some um, what do you want to call it? Bad stuff. Let's just call it bad stuff. There was
Sure. Sure.
lamp oil in the soil from the Civil War days, and it was really fascinating. So we're trying to track it. So we needed to know how the water was moving, and so I just reasoned, well, it's moving from uphill to downhill. Well, then when you get down near the bay, what is that? What is the bay influence on the groundwater, right? And I know we're going a little bit off on this, but this to me
No.
was fascinating. Like, all right, well, let's put a gauge in here and we'll measure this over a period of 4 days. And so I came back, and it was just so wonderful. Like, it was a perfect sine wave, you know.
Yeah.
And you think, well, oh, duh, because the tides, And it was just so interesting. And I had to correlate that with the moon. And so then I had to plot all of this right over time, because what I needed to come up with was, I needed to come up with a model of the water moving down the hill and the tide's effect pushing it back and forth. And so, because the tide changes the gradient and the gradient changes the flow, blah, 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 blah. So that was fascinating. And to come around to answering your question, finally, yes, anybody these days in biology, any science. Not, I'll go so far as to say, not only do they need to know the tools, they need to know Python. And my brother and I were just talking about this because
Yeah.
he went from computer science into bioinformatics, and everything was Python, Jupyter notebooks, and all that stuff. So
Sure.
yeah,
I mean, so you like we're gonna go off on a tangent here. Like I mean, so the thing that I love too, like you're talking about like how, where's the sand come from, all of that, like
yeah,
the scale of everything too. Like you're talking about you're sitting in this canyon, hundreds of feet up, like this took millions of billions of years for this to happen, right? And like you talk about too, like the tide. And the tide is interesting to me because I literally was just talking to my kid
mhm,
about how tides work, because a lot of people like think that it's just literally it's just going in and out. It's not. It's literally the water getting pulled away, right? Like it's
mhm,
so it's like, and I was talking to my kid about like, oh well, it's not back and forth, like it's getting pulled away and pushed back. Like, so it was very funny to me because my kid is 8, very curious kid, on the autism spectrum, has ADHD, just like one of those kids that literally wants to learn everything all the time.
yep.
They were like, oh, that makes sense. And I'm like,
That's great. Okay then.
and I'm like, all right, moving on. Next conversation.
Yeah.
Like we were talking about the international dateline the other day because we're going to Australia in a couple of months. So like, oh, we're flying and we're coming. When we come back, we're actually landing in the past, like that whole thing.
Right.
And like, yeah. Anyway, like kids are
Very funny.
great, but I like that. Back to the thing about scale and like,
Hmm.
because you have to deal with this not just like in geology, but you have to learn like in computer science too, right? Like we talk
Hmm.
about, and I wanted to segue this a little bit into like the .com stuff you were talking about, right?
Yeah.
Like, at some point scale becomes like the utmost importance,
Oh yes.
right? And
Hmm.
I'd love to kind of get your thoughts is like, what are some of the things that, as you kind of did a career change, right? Like,
Hmm.
probably not voluntarily, it just kind of happened, right?
Hmm.
Like, you're doing this stuff in geology and then you got into tech in geology and then you're like, okay, well just tech then. Like, what are some of the things you carried with you from like that geology, like practical science study into kind of like building, .com stuff for the web?
That's a great question. Absolutely. When you're one thing that was pressed into us was, with a science background is observation, observation, observation,
Yep.
observation, and then summation. And you don't ever assert something unless you've got the backup for it, right? And so scientific method, we all know this, but when I went into databases and stuff, I had to check and recheck because, as I
Yeah.
mentioned, $1 million, right? The government will come after
Sure.
us, we'll get
Sure.
sued.
Yeah. Yeah.
You got to be right. And so I definitely took that into my job, the .com thing, where I was not about to be wrong. And of course, I was plenty of times. But when I say wrong, I mean like if a client says they want X, Y, and Z, I will make X, Y, and Z because that's what they asked for. And does this thing do this? Well, yeah. Database, I got to have the data there because I got to have the reports. And I always would think of reports first. Always. I
Yeah.
still do to this day. Reports first because that was the first thing I ever did. And I
Yeah.
realized the importance of everything comes from the reports. Always. And I still get in arguments with developers about this constantly, which is fine. It's good discussion to have because they need to know they're wrong. No, but seriously,
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
you know, the value of a company is the data. Like the
Yeah.
the application exists to put data into a database
Yeah.
that can validate your job and the company's worth. That's it, full stop. And
Yep.
so if the application, of course, is compelling, that's secondary. That's great. You're doing your job. But that compelling application that's going to get into the hands of the people that maybe they can put some pictures in or tweets or whatever, that's generating the data. And
Hmm.
like, just look at Twitter, just to use that as an example, because I brought it up. Your tweets drive engagement, right?
Yep.
It's the data that you're putting into the system that drives more people to come to the site. And that's how they make money, yada, yada.
Hmm.
So anyway, to answer your question directly, yeah, for sure. It was that science background of like, not ever, doing a thing without full backup and
Yeah.
knowing you're correct.
Yeah, this is one of the things that like I've struggled with as somebody who's been a developer or an whatever, right? Some guy who builds stuff, right? It
Mhm.
it's very, and you don't, no one tells you when you're getting started like, oh, like what you're building, all it's the whole point of it is for this business to make money, right?
Mhm.
Unless you're doing open source, and that's a whole conversation, different conversation, whatever, right? But like you talk to like developers, and like they'll spend all this time like trying to like build the divine thing, right? Like the most well architected app there existed. That's all this stuff, and it's like at the end of the day, you're just building something to make a company money. So follow the best path that's going to lead to that best business outcome. Like
Yeah.
if that's like a quick app that's really dirty that does a couple of small things, cool. If it's some hyper scaled Kubernetes cluster, blah blah blah, right, that's another option too. But it's very funny because every developer, at least in my experience, wants to like build the best thing that they've ever built,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, and we used to argue about this constantly back, in the alt.net days, way back in the 2000s. But, there's a couple of members of that community that would just scream about egotism in that sense. Like, you know, y- get yourself out of the way. You're building a thing. Pay
Yeah,
attention to building it correctly, but you're not building a cathedral to Saint, Isaac,
yeah,
right? So
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
idea is, let's get our heads right. And it's funny, what you're saying is such a good perspective to have. I haven't told anybody this, but I'm actually writing another book. I've been writing it over the last year and a half in the Imposter series, which makes me feel slimy saying, but no, I love writing books like that, where people like for humans, let's put it that way. Anyway, it's all about how to go from, it's a riff on Mike Gunderloy's old book, Coder to Developer, but basically going from junior to senior or junior to
yeah,
lead and what do you need to know. And so one of the chapters on a whole theme throughout this is you are, just like you just said, you are building a way to jam data in a database to increase your company's value because
yep,
that value is in that database. And so I, talk about that. But correspondingly, you and I were talking about developer relations before we started here, because that's what
yep,
I in developer relations at Microsoft. And I was in a room with a bunch of other DevRel folks. And this is my personal opinion, by the way. I need to make sure, like
mm-hmm,
Microsoft doesn't come out and say this is what DevRel is.
yep,
But this is my opinion. It's always been my opinion that developer relations exists to further the company's stock price. I mean, like you're there to drive revenue. You're there to engage. And if you do your job right, and if you believe in the thing that you're working on, it's a win-win for everybody. It's
yeah,
like my brother-in-law was a car salesman, and he said one of the best things you can ever do is sell a car that you love, because
yep,
the car will sell itself.
yep,
And you don't have to do much other than put the key in someone's hands and say, go for a drive. And that to me is exactly what developer relations is. But you are absolutely marketing. There you are out there meeting people, you're engaging with them, and you're basically putting the keys in their hands, say, try our stuff,
yep.
and have a good time. And I know I'm probably gonna get some hate mail for that. But I
No,
mean, what I like to think about is keep your feet on the ground, understand that you're there to push the business, and the business knows you're there to push the business. And either you're writing the software to do that or you're engaging developers to do that. That's why you're there. The money doesn't come from nowhere.
yeah,
The money doesn't come from the sky because you're an awesome coder. It comes
yeah.
because you're building something
How about
good.
this? Right, you're worried about getting a little bit of grief. I'll just take all the grief with this statement.
Uh-oh.
We're all in sales. Every
Okay.
single person that works at a company is in sales, right? I was told this a long time ago, and I got kind of upset because I'm like, no, I'm building something, I'm whatever. And his
Yeah.
response is, if you're building this, so someone in sales can sell it. And if you're in marketing,
Fair.
you're marketing this product, so someone in sales can sell
Yeah.
it. So, like, at
Fair.
the end of the day, we're all part of the sales pipeline. And once
Mhm.
I realized that, it kind of, backfed into this whole like, oh, we're all just doing this to make some company money, and then the communist in me is like, no, but
Yeah.
so, but I guess my point is that we need to be very specific with what our goals are when we're in DevRel, right? And I don't mean
Mhm.
like, oh, like engagement, or like, what do you want to get out of the community or who you're engaging with when you're in DevRel, right?
Yeah.
Because if folks who don't know who Rob is, Rob has had kind of this community eye for a long time, right? And
Mhm.
I think one of the big things about DevRel is like you're an ambassador for this company to said community. At least that's
Yep.
at least in my opinion, that's one of the principles.
Nope.
Doesn't
That's
always
exactly
land
it.
like that, but whatever, right?
Right.
So like here's a question for you, stepping a few years back in Rob's timeline, right? So
Sure.
like when you were doing no so when you joined Microsoft to do the .NET stuff,
Hmm.
right? Like you were doing community work, right?
Yep. Yep.
And now you're at Microsoft again after taking a hiatus or a break, and you're doing community work. What
Sort
is
of.
it about the community that has changed?
Mm.
Not the .NET community, but like how we engage with the community, how the community engaged with us back in the mid to late 2000s when you're at Microsoft working on a product, doing community stuff, to now
Yeah.
you're in a DevRel sort of role.
Yeah. Back then, I actually worked for a product team. I worked for the
Yeah,
ASP.NET team, and my specific role was community PM.
yeah,
So I was John Galloway before John Galloway was John Galloway. That's the job I had. And the idea was, to show folks ASP.NET MVC, which was the new platform. So I would do things like I wrote a book with Scott Goo and Hanselman and
yeah,
Hack, right? I contributed some code to it. It was horrible. If Phil was here, he'd laugh. He'd be laughing right now. But it was the HTML helpers. So that to me, is like a prototype. Anyway, I prototyped that. Um, so yeah, it was the idea was to try and soften the blow, because back then, when I say blow, it was like moving everyone's cheese.
yeah.
And there's a lot of opinions about why are we doing this? Web forms works great, which it does. Um, and so I had to kind of answer that. And there's a lot of reasons for it. So that was my role. So I did things like videos, I did the MVC storefront, I did a bunch of stuff that would show people the patterns and the things you could do. My role this time is different. Um, and it is funny. I think it was Seth Juarez reached out to me on Twitter and said, "We're hiring and you'd fit
Hmm.
great here." And I
Sure.
said, "Are you kidding me? Like, I'm not into DevRel." And
Yeah.
and his reply was great. He said, "I don't know anyone who does DevRel more than you do." And I'm like, "I do not. I make things, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
and then I started to sit there. I'm like, actually, that's pretty much all I do. I mean, of course, I make things, but like
Yeah.
I do outreach, and so
That's
and I
also
talked to
Seth being the amazing salesperson that he is, right?
That's right. Oh,
Yeah.
Seth is great. So it is funny, touching. So anyway, really quickly, I talked to Tim Hewer.
Hmm.
I said, of course, always take an interview. Always take
Yep.
the interview. Never say no. But I talked to Tim, and Tim said, we have a pretty strong idea what you could do. And I'm like, oh, God, what is that? I was kind of being a bit of a snot. Like, what is that? Because I know Tim going way back. And
Sure.
he said, we need you to tell us how Azure sucks.
Mm. Yeah.
I mean, you want to put catnip in front of me? I mean,
Yeah.
not that I like to tell people they suck, but I love to optimize, right? I love to optimize experience. And he said, we're trying to do outreach for people that are coming in from the non-Microsoft communities. And we want you to help us engage those folks and like help Azure become better. So my role started out being inward focused. It wasn't outward.
Yeah.
So I would bring what I knew from the industry into Microsoft. And that's
Sure.
pretty much what I've been doing up until the last 6 months or so, where I started doing something more along the lines of what I was doing before, which is a lot of fun. We can talk about that at some point if you want when we
Yeah.
finish up here. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so it's funny that you talk like one of the things that, so as somebody who has been predominantly in developer marketing, right? So
Hmm.
like my backstory is I was a .NET developer. I started out in classic ASP and then .NET, and then I've been a Microsoft technology developer my entire professional career, more or less.
Hmm.
Um, and then eventually, like I had an opportunity to get into market or to get into like the field, right? Which I was at Microsoft doing like evangelism for customers, and I really enjoyed like the storytelling aspect of trying to get customers to use technology, and that led me into marketing, developer marketing, and that's kind of where I've been, right? So the thing is that I have a challenge with the developer marketing in general, and this is a spicy take, like it's a lot of vaporware, and it's
Oh
this is
yeah.
like and it's kind of like a lot of BS, right? Like
Yep.
it's and one of the things that I've really strived to try to instill with the things that I've done is like try to get authenticity because
Hmm.
like developers well. I think I know developers really well. They smell the bullshit immediately,
Hmm.
right? Like
Yep.
And if you're not authentic, they're just going to say, okay, bye, I'll go somewhere
Oh yeah,
else.
yeah.
And it's this balancing act of like you want to instill like, oh, this is the greatest thing that you're ever going to use, blah blah blah. Also,
Yep.
but like here's the practical implementations of said thing, right?
Yep.
And I think that you're kind of cut of a similar cloth to that. So like, how does that balance out? Because you said earlier, like you're in marketing in DevRel. Like
Hmm.
traditionally, like sure you might be aligned in engineering or whatever, but like you're marketing, like you're trying to get the community to use
Hmm.
products.
Yep.
So, how do you kind of balance that level of shock and awe with like rationalism?
Well, I have lots to say about this. I'm trying to organize my thoughts.
Sure.
Like again, half of marketing is to understand. Well, you understand the people using the thing. You
Yep.
also have to understand the thing. And a lot of times, if the process of understanding the thing will take you down a road of saying, oh, you know what? If I just tweak it this way, if I just move it like this, if I add this one thing to it, then it'll sell itself. And like, there's so many services out there. Like Netflix is the canonical example where like you get the DVDs in the mail and they're like, well, wait, what if we did a streaming thing?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
And so someone in that company, which was probably a marketer, said, streaming is coming now. And
Hmm.
so that's what the market wants. So anyway, to get back to your point, how do I balance it? So one of my things has internally, like I will make things. And I do this all the time. I will make things to stress test or to, I will do these little reports internally and say like, well, okay, if I'm coming from the Node world or the Rails world or whatever, here's what I would expect.
Yep.
I just did that with this API thing I'm making. It's a minimal API. I've been working with .NET again, which has been fun. But I got really confused with a couple things. And me being me, ripping the stereo apart, trying to hook the
Hmm.
speakers up to the TV, I couldn't figure out configuration. Did I say configure out? I couldn't figure out configuration. And so
Yep.
I went in there and tried to understand it. People were pointing me to the docs. I got
Yeah.
thoroughly confused. And so I was talking to a colleague, Aaron Whistling, about Viper, which is this thing in Go, which like makes configuration just wonderfully easy. And we kind of looked at each other like, well, let's see if we can just make it in .NET.
Yeah.
And so we put a wrapper around Microsoft's the iConfiguration stuff, put a wrapper around the app settings and added some convention and did a bunch of stuff. And I literally just pushed that package to NuGet yesterday, showed it to the ASP.NET team. And I said, this is the kind of thing I'm expecting. I want to work with environment variables. I want to be able to pull them off disk from a .env file. I also want to get my settings from a JSON file, blah, 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 blah.
Sure.
And, we went back and forth a little bit, but they started to see like, oh, I get it, you know?
Yeah.
So anyway, if you go on NuGet, you can see it viper.net, which is fun. But that's just like a thing I just pushed because why not?
Yeah.
And that's kind of a neat thing about being at Microsoft these days. One of the major things that's changed is the focus on open source. And one of our OKRs, or one of our ways that we measure our worth, is we
Measure our
have to
worth.
do a certain amount of open source work. So
Yeah.
that's one of the things. And so, yeah, and so I haven't told a lot of people this, but in the last 6 months, um, I had this idea that goes back to what you're saying about authenticity, where we had this thing called Tailwind Traders that it was kind of this brand.
I'm well aware of Tailwind Traders. I used to own it. Yeah.
Oh, you
Yeah,
did?
when I
Okay.
was before I left Microsoft a few years ago, like I was on the team
Oh,
that owned and managed Tailwind Traders, Rock Paper Scissors Spock, as
oh yeah,
Azure
okay.
Tips and Tricks. Yeah, so
Yeah,
I sorry to interrupt you. I'm well
that's
versed in
okay.
Tailwind Traders. Yeah, it's a
Yeah, no,
canonical kind of hero demo for things.
it's supposed to be right. So Scott Kate, when I first joined,
Yeah.
threw that at me and it's like, let's build this. And so that we did. And so like when Ignite the tour came together,
Mm-hmm.
the idea was that we had a coherent story. So I helped him, at least I think it was the first rev. I'm not sure if it was the first. I helped him build out some stuff, which was fun. So that's sat dormant, for a long time. And so
It's archived now. Yeah.
I was chatting with somebody internally. I said, what we really need here is we really need some apps that people can plug and play to build a business, like
Mm-hmm.
APIs,
Mm-hmm.
but legit things like that we would use for ourselves. And I said, one of the first things, of course, I thought was, because me being I have a mailing list, right? It would
Yeah.
be to build a mailing list API application
Yeah.
using Markdown and whatever. So you could send out, to your list of hundreds or thousands or whatever, how many people you got. And so we kind of threw some ideas back and forth. The ASP.NET team said, well, we'd love to be able to stress test minimal API, build it. And so I was like, okay. And so I started making this thing. And then I thought, you know what? This should all go under the Tailwind Traders brand. And we should build these blocks. I started calling them blocks. I was thinking starter kits, but that kind of has some old school context to it.
Yeah.
I want to have something that someone can say, I'm going to build a business on top of that, which is what .NET Nuke did back in the day with one of the starter kits, which is awesome. So anyway, that's what I started building. And so I've had some help from certain groups internally, and it's all open source up on GitHub. Along the way, what I'm also doing is writing documentation for minimal API that is a little bit more process oriented or something like that.
Sure.
I'm not sure how to put it, but we of course have learned docs. I don't want to say anything negative about that, but what I wanted to do is I wanted to have a story about how you might use minimal API using some real applications. So that's what I'm building.
That's great. I mean, I have a lot to unpack there, and we don't have enough time. I've been, I don't know whether it's just based on the roles that I've been in or the level of curiosity, but I've always constantly came back to this. Okay, so do we have anything that a customer can pick up today and actually use?
There you go.
Right. And I mean, I used to say this a lot. I said it when I was at Microsoft, and I said it when I was in a Microsoft and whatever, right? But so I think Microsoft does two things really, really well in the demo space. They do the hello world really well. And then they do here's a huge diagram of stuff.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And the in between that customers actually need, it's really, really hard. No company does it well. And I've always tried to figure out okay, so how do you build modular scenarios to kind of fit into what a customer actually will do? And I found out over the course of doing this for years, it's really, really hard, because the second you start to build these things, customers treat them as gospel. And I've been very much of the somebody asks me oh, what's best practice for this? I'm like, there is no best practice. Best practice does not exist. It's whatever works for your business and what your needs are, right? But people don't like hearing that. People want the big tech companies to say this is the way to do it. But then they also don't want the big tech companies to force them to have lock-in into their products, right? And this all goes around to this thing that I'm after we get off this, I'm going to look at this thing you're going to show me, right? And because me personally, I see all these tools that can make developers' lives better, but I always run into this. Okay, so how complicated are we getting, right?
That's right.
I've gone down this path because I'm trying to learn Go, right? I've tried to learn Go 100 times, but I told myself I'm going to learn Go. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to do it. And how I decided to do that is I'm going to start contributing to the Azure Dev CLI, which is a pretty large Go application. And I'm going through all this stuff, and I'm okay, so how do I get started building? So okay, dev containers in Visual Studio Code, and then I waited 45 minutes for the thing to be done standing up, right?
That's right.
And I have a fully functioning environment, and I was just am I at the point in my career where I just literally I do something and then I wait, and then all this magic happens that I don't want to know.
Right.
Right. And I'm somebody who's genuinely curious. I'm like you, Rob. I'm very curious. I want to learn how this stuff works. But I know, because I know Isaac very well, if I start to look into this stuff, I'm going to never come out.
That's right.
So the the question becomes, and this is one of the questions I'd like to kind of finish up on, is what is too complicated and what is not complicated enough in this world? When we're trying to build tools, build demos, build products, build things for the average developer. I don't like using the word average, but the developer who doesn't want to spend their entire life learning something new. They want to make some money. They want to have a good work-life balance. They want to do these things, but they also don't want to get lost in the shuffle and then stuck in some job forever because they haven't been able to learn. What is the balance?
Well, I'm going to throw some theoretical answer at you.
Sure, of course.
if you like, one of the silly things I did when I was doing the Imposter's Handbook is I spent way too much time trying to understand complexity theory. But I'm glad I did, because I can spot these problems. Um, and I will venture to say, I will make the claim that what is too complex and what is not complex, what are we building, is it correct for the target? I'm going to say that is a NP hard problem, meaning that it is an optimization problem. It is
Yeah.
something you cannot figure out until you just do it. So
Yeah.
if you just do it, that's a greedy algorithm. You do the thing that you see come in front of. That's the whole agile is. I posed this to a friend who's an agile person, and I said, agile is just a greedy algorithm way of building software, right? And he
Yeah.
said, absolutely. You just
Yep.
do what comes next, and then you do that long enough, and hopefully you don't back yourself into a corner.
Mhm.
But that's just the nature of software. It's the nature of life, right? You're going to build a thing that is going to eventually get too complex, and you're going to rewrite it, and just embrace it. So I'm going to give you an example, a hardcore example of something I just did, which is I was using Entity Framework to queue up 10,000 emails to go out in this mail list server I was telling you about.
Sure.
And Entity Framework built this massive query with like 10,000 parameters to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, yikes, being the database person I am, this is literally an insert select right here, you know?
Yeah.
And so I just jumped right out and I said, I'm writing a function for this. That function is going to be 5 lines of SQL, maybe 6. And I sat there, I'm like, you think people would freak out? I'm like, and Aaron and I, whistling again, we have this mantra: if this is what you would do in the real world, this is what we're going to do here. And
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, absolutely. I'd have this database full of functions. So that's what I
Yeah.
did.
Yeah. Man, it's so funny how like we have like as developers and technology generally have things that like, oh, I had to do this because it was the fastest, most efficient, most profitable way, but I hated doing it because I
Yeah.
didn't, like, back to our conversation earlier, like it doesn't bring me developer joy.
Yeah.
Like I didn't spend a week building out some complicated thing. Like I just wrote a stored procedure. Or I wrote a
Yeah.
function that took
That's
took
right.
an hour, right? And I
Yeah.
think that we're constantly in this war internally, but doing the thing that we think is the right thing with what is actually the right thing,
Yep.
right?
Sure.
And
Oh, yeah.
like that's the outside of tech thing. That's a life thing in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
But like, so this is a great place to end it too, because I think one of the things that I've struggled with in my career is like just being okay with things not going the way I want them to go exactly, right?
Mhm.
Like I've said this to a million people, like I got control issues. Like, so
Mhm.
being able to relinquish control is like very,
Yep.
very challenging. And I think it's challenging for a lot of folks that take pride in the things they do, right?
Yep.
So, and I don't know if you have a similar thing where you're like, I have to do it like this. I want to do it like this. Maybe this is the tech I want to use. Maybe this is the framework I want to use. Maybe I want to, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Mhm.
so when you go about building something, do you try to just, like you say, bang out something and just, okay, optimization, that's what I want to focus on, is the optimization? Or do you instead maybe go, is this what is going to bring Rob joy? Or are
Oh,
those two
yeah.
things the same?
No. So what brings me joy is solving a problem. And
Yep.
I enjoy writing code. I hate friction. And so here's a good example. The Viper thing that I was telling you about, the configuration stuff, I didn't want to use app settings. So to me, settings is just JSON files, right? I know how to read a JSON file.
Yep.
But John Galloway, I was chatting with him, and he said, you know what? Our iConfig stuff has a lot of really cool things under the hood.
Yep.
You should try and use it. And I was like, you know what? This is to answer your question. Step outside of what I expect and what I
Yep.
want. Control issue, right? I have that too. And try and do something different and see what happens. Well, long story short, he was right. Like all of these plugins and all these things I could add in there, where I'm now enhancing something that already exists. I'm not replacing it. And it just, at the end of the day yesterday, I was like ecstatic, because like I had solved a problem for me,
Yep.
hopefully solved it for other people too, and also challenged myself to give up control and just try something new. And I was actually chatting with Jeremy Miller on Mastodon about it, and he was ripping me apart, because I mean we're good friends, so
Yep.
he can rip me apart anytime. But it was great. He's like, oh, you just don't come in here and say everything sucks and try and replace it. I'm like, I'm not. Oh, actually, I am.
Yep.
So anyway, that was a good moment.
That's great. And I think it's the I love like if we can all. That's the one thing I'll always give advice. Somebody asks me for advice in tech. It's like just try to think outside of your own comfort zone a little bit.
Oh yeah,
Whether
push
it's with
yourself.
the social part of tech, whether it's the tech part of tech, whether it's whatever, right? Because you'll learn so much about yourself as well as you'll learn something new. Because otherwise, like you're gonna get stuck. Like I tell this all the
Yep.
time. Like you will get stuck in your job, in your career,
Oh yeah.
in your life if you just literally just, close your eyes and just walks forward, right?
Yep.
And that's the one piece of advice that I can give folks is like try to be curious, try to be empathetic, try like want to step outside of your comfort zone because it doesn't feel good. Like one of the
Oh
things
yeah.
people know about me, I cold plunge. Like I jump in
There you go.
freezing water every day, not because I like it, but because I've thought about some really interesting things while I'm trying to not focus on freezing to death,
There
right?
you go. That's great. Yeah.
And it's one of those things too, like in tech, like trying to learn new things. Like I joke about learning Go. Like I'm trying to because I think that's important because I see all these cool things that people are building in Go, and people tell me that
Yeah.
Go is better than .NET. And I'm like, no, .NET's still the best. I don't care, right?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so yeah, one of the things that I also want to be really respectful of is your time, and I want to kind of wrap up here.
Yeah,
Um,
well, really quick, I
yeah,
just
yeah,
wanted to tell you something. I interviewed my mom for a
yeah.
podcast
Please,
I
let's.
also
Yeah, we
do.
talked about this before. Let's talk about it really
Just
quick. So
really
you,
fast, I wanted to tell you,
yeah,
my mom's 94 and a half years old,
yeah,
and her husband just passed away 6 months ago, and she's, of course, very sad. And but she was telling me, she's like, I heard some self-help book describe that 93 was kind of the end of the road. And she just looked me in the eye. She goes, "Why would anyone ever want to think that?" And she kind of looked at me. She says, "You learn something new every day.
yeah,
You have to learn something new. That's going to keep you alive." And I was like, "Go, mom." And
yeah.
of course, she's learning all these sewing things because she likes sewing, but she's also learning some cooking stuff. Anyway, I just to echo what you said, 94 and a half year old lady, learn something new every day. I think it's great.
I can't. We were talking a bit about things being a bit too hard or kind of being tired and these sort of things, like the energy to be able to continually have that sort of that corny or not growth mindset, right?
Yep.
Like that's
Rip the
something that
stereo apart.
yeah, like you can't teach it. Like
Yeah.
in my opinion, you either you want that, you want all the things that go into that, or you just
Yep.
don't. Um, this has been great, Rob. I really appreciate you taking the time to be on the show and
Yep.
chat with me.
Of course.
I want to finish off with one final question, and
Yep.
we've been talking about a lot of things right over the last
Yep.
hour or so, and I want you to kind of think back a little bit. We've talked about all these topics, and one of the things I'd love to kind of hear if you could think about all these things that we've been talking about, whether the open source stuff, the tech stuff, the mental aspects of learning and DevRel and all these things, and you can kind of summarize this conversation that we've had in 2 words. What would those 2 words be for you, Rob?
Let's just take it to one. Learn.
I usually do one, and then people are like, "No, that's too
Yeah.
hard." I'm like, "Okay, you
No,
can
man.
cheat, you can
Like
cheat."
it's funny because Hanselman and I we do this developers live, the other podcast, and that's what we do before we even start doing anything. We figure out the one word title that we're gonna because if
Yeah,
we can't distill it down to one word, then we don't have a show. And so for this
yeah.
one, I would say learn is the word,
Learn.
man. Learn is the word.
This is great. So for folks, if you're not following Rob, please do. You can find him on Twitter, Rob Conery, RobConery. There'll also be some links to some really cool things and ways to find Rob on other platforms, as well as the Imposter's Handbook and all sorts of cool stuff. So please, I urge you, listener, right now, listener in the future,
Begging you.
yeah, please pay attention to what Rob Connery's doing because
Oh my goodness, that's funny.
you'll have your day will be brightened up because mine has been for the last hour. So
Yay.
Rob, before we sign off, do you got anything you want to last parting
No,
words?
thanks. This has been fun. I appreciate it. I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
This has been great. So thank you everybody that tuned in live and the people that are listening in the future. This is Isaac Levin from Coffee and Open Source. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.